Welcome everybody. This is the Master Gardeners of Hamilton County sponsor this program. It's called the Third Saturday Gardening Program. It's been going on for several years now. Usually it was held at the Ag Center on Saturday morning from 10 to noon. And it's evolved in the last year or so into a Zoom meeting. And we've been very successful getting anywhere from 30 to 60, 70 people chime in. And we're welcoming today a person that's given a lot of talks on the native plants, Ron McKitrick. Ron's very active with the Master Gardeners of Hamilton County. He's presently the vice president of the organization, getting involved with organizing and bringing in great speakers to the group. We have lectures at different times for the group, and we decided to branch off and have this lecture on third Saturday for the general public. So if you're interested, tune into this. And if you're wanting to get on a mailing list or an email list, we call it the Friends of Master Gardeners list. Maybe that's where you heard about it. Then just put in your email in the chat, and we'll try to get that signed up. And if not, just go to Friends of Master Gardeners and you can self-subscribe. It's just a once a month subscription of all the things that the Master Gardeners are doing in Hamilton County and beyond. So without any further talk by me, I want to introduce Ron McKitrick.
Thank you, Tom. Before we get started, I just want to say that if you're interested in plants and not part of the Master Gardening program, it's a lot of great people that are interested in gardening. So, compatriots that like to talk about what they're doing and have a lot of information. So I'd look into it. Presentation today, I'm going to concentrate on one aspect of natives, and that's native shrubs. And I'm going to approach this from the way I kind of do gardening, and I'm kind of figuring out what I do. And I like the term ecological gardening from the standpoint of doing something in my yard that will encourage not only plant growth, but also the mammals, the birds, the insects that are associated with that, as well as taking into consideration the environmental factors of cold, type of texture of soil, the sun, shady, whatever. And we'll talk about that as we go ahead. But I think you'll kind of see my approach. I'm not saying it is everybody's approach, but I think we can see maybe how this can fit into your gardening and how you approach that. One shot on the side of my house. This is on the south-facing side. This is a spring shot. This year, this particular year, everything was kind of blooming that's supposed to bloom at about the same time. For whatever this year, my azaleas, native azaleas back here are blooming a lot later. So I did the red bud bloomed early. Right now, what you can see back here are the columbine, and the azaleas are blooming right now. And those are either trees or small trees, shrubs, and then I have a lot of ground covers of different types, but that's a different discussion. I'll get this right in a minute. So I'm talking about native plants. So you might ask, what is a native plant? And this is the way I approach it. We're in hardiness zone 7, which talks about freeze dates. So the higher the number, the warmer it is. So if you get down to zone 9, you're in Florida. And if you're in zone 4, you're up in either the mid-Atlantic or the Midwest, that type of northern Midwest. So we're in zone 7 generally. So I want to see something that will grow in zone 7, not be killed off. And that generally then grows in the southeast and was here, which is the key, before Europeans came to North America. So they were here before we started settling this area. Other people approach it in different ways, but this is the way I'm looking at this, so that you know what I'm talking about. And you might want to know, okay, well, I haven't done a actual physical count, but if I had to estimate, I'd say about 85% of what I have planted are natives. And that is one of my criteria as far as what I'm going to do. If I can find native Tennessee plants, that doesn't mean they're endemic, meaning they only grow here or in very selected areas, but they grow in Tennessee, they may grow in Alabama, they may grow in Virginia, but they grow in zone 7 in Tennessee at a minimum. Ecotypes, particularly in shrubs, are hard to come by. People selling them as ecotypes. And an ecotype, think of, this isn't a shrub, but you may be familiar with the common butterfly weed. And it grows from Florida all the way up to Wisconsin. So you can imagine bloom times can't happen all at the same time. They have to be different, and that becomes genetically fixed. But the plant looks, the one in Florida looks like the one in Wisconsin. So what they look like are the same, but there may be some ability to adapt to an area. If people are selling ecotypes, that's great. If not, I try to go to the species. The other selection is I do non-native plants. So I want to say, is this going to be a native plant or a non-native plant? Then I'll go to the species next. If I can't find something that will meet the need, I'll look at varieties. These are things that occur naturally in nature that make it a little bit different, and they do sell these. The problem with varieties is that they're often done through cuttings so that they'll stay the same, and then they'll name them and they'll become either cultivars because they're being genetically identical to one another, or cultivars are often bred by crossing different types of similar plants, and they will not, if you plant the seed, come exactly like what you bought. It's like tomatoes. You get a hybrid tomato and you plant the seeds and anything could come up. And then finally, I do have hybrids in my garden, as well as other non-native plants that I've picked up after I decided what I was doing to fill in places. So that's how I approach this. And why am I so big on native plants? Well, my background is more or less as an ecologist. Something I've always enjoyed, and I had an opportunity when we moved up to Ottawa to build a place and start thinking about what I wanted to do, and retired and said, well, you know, native plants, started doing some reading and saw that a lot of things are kind of becoming, if not endangered, at least in decline. So thinking about this, wildlife are adapted to using native plants. That makes sense. I mean, our wildlife aren't particularly adapted to using European plants, aren't adapted to using Asian plants that may have be in a zone 7, but they don't use them. So that's not what I want to encourage. Some people may want to encourage that, not having wildlife in their gardens, but they're naturally hardy. And again, that makes sense. If they're growing here and they've been here for a long time, that is a demonstration of them being hardy, being able to survive the conditions we have here in East Tennessee. Tennessee has an incredible diversity of native plants from West, Middle, and East Tennessee, but realizing that Some of these are adapted to particular types of things like the glades in Middle Tennessee. We may have a hard time growing those plants here, or the more or less coastal plains area in West Tennessee, the sandy soils. But with that being said, native plants, if you have a particular challenging area in your garden trying to grow something, it may be worth a little work, saying that it's very shady, very wet, and I'm not having much success with the garden plants I'm getting from nurseries. Look and see what grows in those conditions here in Tennessee, and it may be available to you and something to try. I'm not a big proponent of scare ecology, but one of the things that I have noticed and have read about is through the years, there's been a decline over the last 50 years of avifauna birds. We've lost populations of around almost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. And that's about 30% of the North American avifauna population. So that's a substantial decline. A lot of those, it's not across every species, but it's very noticeable in sparrows, finches, warblers, a lot of the small birds that don't get the attention but are extremely important. On the other hand, our waterfowl, through hunting laws, the hunters demand that they have waterfowl coming through. They pay for it, and therefore there's a lot of places that they can rest, a lot of places that they can feed. They're protected and limited to number of catch, and actually waterfowl populations are increasing. So it kind of shows with some sort of thought about what's around us that maybe we can do some good and get some of these other bird populations at least stable. And I think that's a worthwhile effort. Going along with that though, and this is the bird population has been pretty well researched. The insect population is, people are looking at it, the data is sparse, but they're doing more and more work with insects, and they've noticed a substantial decline. One study in Germany noted a 75% decline of the flying insect biomass in the last 27 years, to be 30 years now since the study. Other studies in different areas worldwide are indicating insect populations declining. Some maybe in the 15%, maybe 5% a year, up to 30% is not uncommon. So why am I talking about birds and insects? Well, native plants support native insects. And in fact, that's extremely important because most of our birds, they either eat insects of some sort, or they feed their young insects, meaning that if they were seed eaters, something like a cardinal, something like a finch, when they start raising their young, they'll actually start going after things like caterpillars that are easy to digest, high in protein, therefore their young can grow a lot quicker, and they'll start feeding insects to the young birds. If you don't have that, then those young birds, one of two things, either a lot of birds will note or be aware of the decline of insects somehow, and where they normally have a clutch of 5 eggs, they may have a clutch of 2 or 3 eggs. If it continues to decline, maybe one of those birds out of the 3 will survive. And actually, I did some work with cattle egrets that documented that in Middle Alabama, showing that when there was insect populations were high, we got a lot of eggs from these birds, and we also got a lot of survival. So insect populations declining may be one of the different causes of why bird populations are declining. There's also been work with non-native plants, and the work indicates that actually insect growth is insect populations are smaller on non-native plants as a generality, and therefore there are fewer insects to feed the birds. Work being done, you may know Doug Ptolemy or heard of him, and I'll give a reference at the end, but he's been a leader with this and his graduate students looking at native and non-native plants and how caterpillars, other types of insects use non-natives versus native. And of course, again, maybe non-native is the way you want to go because you don't want these critters around. But, you know, think about what I'm saying. So as insect populations decline, the hypothesis is so do the bird populations. Now, again, there's other reasons, pesticide use, growth, turning woods into parking lots and building areas for homes. All of that is reducing habitat. So all of these things kind of come together, putting a lot of stress on the animals that live there. So what I'm saying is, if you want to feed the birds, first feed the bugs. And this is where I kind of looked at taking an ecological approach to gardening. And you say, why? Well, think about it. Many bugs of different types are herbivorous. They're eating plant material. They're chewing on it. They're getting the sap by sucking it. They're actually wood borers, gall makers, pollen feeders. All of these things, if the insect population is adapted to these native plants, that will encourage them. So that's my thought process of going into this. And with the bird population in particular, I'm trying to create habitat for reproduction, getting them to nest in this area. Certainly it's nice to have them come through and feed and move on, but if I don't have a place where they can build a nest, they'll move on, but at least they'll have food. Seasonal food is critical. Cover is critical from the standpoint of getting birds to nest, and shrubs are certainly an important part of that. And having water in your yard is helpful, but shrubs aren't particularly going to solve that problem for birds. It may help retain moisture in your soil and be good for the guys that live in the ground. One of the things that I would suggest you do is kind of develop a plan. I kind of did this backwards, but that's not saying you should. And one of the things is, just because it's a native plant, if you put it in the ground doesn't necessarily mean it's going to grow there. These native plants have adapted to shady areas, sunny areas, dry areas, wet areas, different kinds of soil, different kinds of pH. So you need to do a little bit of work about what do you want, and what type of these types of places do you have around your house? And I put this, what do I want, in a function category. Your function category may be completely different from mine, but I want to get shelter for the critters. I want to have food, seasonal food, and I'd like to make my yard sustainable, meaning what is growing there kind of stays there. My inputs and outputs are balanced. And if you think about runoff, particularly in our urban areas where water comes, stays around your house for a little bit, but most of it is just run off into the sewers. I'd like to try to get that in balance, and we'll talk a little bit about that too. In my yard, the habitats types that I have are ground covers, and I'm doing more and more of that in the form of green mulch, meaning that there's something there year round and help maintain soil temperature as well as moisture, and keep me from throwing out just yards and yards of mulch, of which I'm still doing, but I'm getting better at it. But I also have vines, perennials. We're going to talk about shrubs and trees that are all native. Okay, let's talk about a few shrubs that I have that I think work fairly well. I live out in Ottawa, it's Ridge and Valley area. Some of these will work just about anywhere around Chattanooga, even up in, let's say, Lookout Mountain area, something like that. Still do okay. Others may not, because you're going to have different soils, depths, and this type of soil depths and pHs. So you got to be aware of that. So Ninebark is one of those. Now, this is a cultivar of Ninebark. The species itself has green leaves. This is, I think, Diablo cultivar that has this coppery color leaf. But I think it's very pretty, and I'm using it more or less as one of the screening areas. I think I'll show you a picture later. Running along the back of my house is a chain link fence with barbed wire on top. Not the most attractive thing. I obviously didn't put it there, but if you're familiar with the Summit softball area out in Ottawa, Collegedale, that is an old Summit landfill that has been closed for around 20 years. But the chain link fence kind of marks the area. And if you march through my yard from the chain link fence, the property is actually in Chattanooga. You walk about 10 feet and you're in Ottawa, and you walk towards the front of the house and I'm in Collegedale. So property lines vary, but plants don't care about that. So Ninebark, some of the information, common name, we just talked about. Many of the things I'm going to mention are deciduous shrubs. We can talk about evergreen shrubs when we have time, but most of them are deciduous shrubs, but many of them have interest year round. The Ninebark has a fairly broad range, and you'll see this central to Eastern North America, fairly common. A lot of the plants we have along the East Coast will grow in the Midwest until sometimes you get up into the prairie areas, they may be more rare. But you think about central Missouri, south, even further north in Missouri, you'll get a lot of these plants growing, but they'll be at the end of their range. Another thing to note is height. Now, your criteria may be that you want this particular plant underneath your bay window. And if it gets to 8 feet, what you've done is created some work for yourself, because you're going to have to be, Ninebark is medium growth rate, I'd say, but in a few years, it'd be covering that beautiful bay window you have, and you're going to have to be out there with clippers cutting it back. So your function may be that you want something that is underneath a window, a foundation plant, or you may want it back at the edge of a woodland area, so of which height wouldn't make any difference. In fact, it may be a good thing. Realizing spread is also important. I mean, if you got you're not going to do square foot gardening with Ninebark. So realize that it can grow relatively high and spread. maybe bloom times of what you're interested in. So these are different kinds of things you can look at. Here, blooms, those blooms you saw, May and June is common. They attract a lot of different insects, butterflies, bees, native flies, beetles come there. Beautiful blooms. You saw how they were clustered. Will grow in a fairly, far as sun is concerned, from full sun to part shade. Interesting here, note the water when we go through these things. It will be from dry to medium. So if you have a very wet area or moist area all the time, this may not be the best place for it, but this is what it would prefer. If you're going to trim it a lot, then maintenance is medium. If you're just going to let it grow, you're going to have to go back and, cut out dead branches and that stuff occasionally. I'm using it actually as a screening hedge. I have multiple layers to try to screen things. And this is at the front because the copper is a pretty color and people can see it from the street. So I think it's nice. Beautiful showy flower. But look at this, what it tolerates. That doesn't mean that it will grow to 8 feet. It may only grow to 5 feet in these areas, but it's drought tolerant, has a good root system, so it will stabilize in an area that's eroding. Does well in clay soils. Boy, is that good, huh? Dry soils, wet soils, shallow, rocky soils. That kind of describes East Tennessee, I think. And if you have black walnuts, it's one of the few plants, or one of the plants that will actually grow with black walnuts. Another plant that I have, and I'm just starting to use this more and more, and it's becoming kind of in my favorite category, is New Jersey tea. And it gets its name from actually, back in the day when we had tea taxes up in Massachusetts and the Boston area, people actually were using this plant for making teas. And the common name became New Jersey tea. So it's, I think, a very good plant for the following reasons. Again, it's deciduous, but New Jersey tea, Henry's Garnet, is a cultivar, and I'll talk about why it's called Henry's Garnet in a minute, but it's native to East and Central Tennessee, a relatively shorter plant, 3 to 4 feet, 3 to 5 foot spread. So this may be consideration for a function that you have. Bloom times, long bloom time from May to July, which is a little unusual for a lot of plants, their blooming period. Beautiful, you saw those white flowers up on the terminal part of the plant. Grow in full sun to part shade. Again, dry to medium soil. I did make a mistake and put this in a wetter area, and it didn't do well. But it's low in maintenance. I have it in other areas now, and it's doing fantastic. The flowers are showy, a nice benefit. They're fragrant, and they look nice as cut flowers. You can put in arrangements in your house. Big benefit, they attract hummingbirds as well as butterflies. And when you see the term butterflies, that means other pollinators as well. So your bees, and butterflies, as well as some of our birds, come and get the nectar from New Jersey tea. Small flowers, but it attracts a lot of things. The fragrance may be one of the reasons that they come here. But again, it's drought tolerant, so dry soils are good. Shallow, rocky soils are good. And again, tolerate black walnut. Realize when I say these are drought or they will grow in dry soils, that does not mean you can take the plant from a nursery or wherever you get it, put it in that dry soil area and walk away. these plants have been growing in different kinds of areas under different conditions. And I can almost guarantee you, if you do that, that plant will die. So for at least, let's say, 3 to 5 days, it's going to require almost daily watering. It's going to require being watered in as you, before you plant it, to get it started well. After the 3 to 5 days or so, the plant should be perking up a little bit, doing well. Hopefully the root system, which is critical to all of this, will start to grow into the soils that you have there. At the end of that, for the next year or two, or depending upon the size of the plant, maybe 3, you want to ensure that at least gets an inch of water a week. So you can figure out what an inch of water is. If you heard that there was a rainstorm that dropped an inch in your area, well, you don't have to go out and water it. Soon as that time period, it's established and growing well, is over, you probably just need to leave that plant alone. If it's a if it's a droughty area, the root system will be established and it will do well. Here, one of the things I am trying to do with this is not particularly a shrubby border, but I'm trying to use it as a shrubby ground cover. That is, in my opinion, a hard to grow area. It's dry and has rocky slopes and banks on it. And I'm putting these relatively close together, less than 3 feet apart, so that they'll just grow together and maybe be a 3 foot high ground cover in this area, establish it and keep it from having runoff. Another one, I like this name. It's a common name. It's not the name that most people use for this plant, but witch alder. It's called Dwarf Gilla. But another thing that I try to do is have early blooming plants. This particular one that I have, the flowers have actually gone by now, or just about. They were blooming fully maybe 2 to 3 weeks ago, lasting 3 to 4 weeks at the most. They bloom before the leaves come out, and then the leaves will follow and be nice and green and form kind of a hedge along the fence I have here. One of the things they will do is that they'll sprout. So you'll have little witch alders coming out. That's up to you if you want them to do that or not, but just be aware that you may be having sprouts coming out. In addition to that, beautiful fall color. I mean, it is shocking. It's just a orangey red color, beautiful leaves that will drop, but beautiful plant. So again, this is one, instead of being central and north or eastern, it's primarily a southeastern plant. So you're going to see it from here. Maybe as things go up coastally, you'll see them growing in the wild. Fairly short. This is a dwarf Gilla. There is one that gets 6 to 8 feet high, but this is a native dwarf. Gets up to maybe 3 to 4 feet, spread about the same. Blooms very early. Mine aren't going to make it to May. They started late March, early April, I think. You saw the beautiful white flowers, full sun, part shade. Water here, medium. Maintenance is low. I haven't done anything to mine at all in the last 4 years. Hedges, one thing that you can do with it, showy fragrant flowers, as I mentioned, good fall color, but it also, most of the things that I'm talking about typically are maybe growing in the wild in pH areas that are neutral, meaning 7, or slightly acidic, 6.5. As you know, the pH range runs from 1 to 14. As the numbers get smaller, you have a more acidic soil. As the numbers get larger, over 7, a more basic soil, limey soil. So a lot of these plants are neutral. So a pH of 7 to 6.5, they do very well. Most of the ones that I've mentioned, and this would actually fall into an area that prefers a little more acidic soil. As you noted down here, or note down here, it's a good plant to put with your rhododendrons, perhaps. They enjoy a more acidic soil, and so does Gilla, but they'll grow, be blooming, that white bloom with whatever kind of azalea or rhododendron color you might have, and white kind of blends with all of those and will be at a lower level. So that's one of the things to think about. How are you going to mix the plants you have? You don't want something that you wouldn't want a plant that grows in a very pH of 8 and mix it with something that grows with a pH of 5. One of them isn't going to make it. So that's why you want to look at pH and know the pH of your soil. Spend a little bit of time with blueberries. I love blueberries just to eat, but to have around. And I kind of looked at what I was going to do. The 2 types are typically sold around here. One called the high bush blueberry, and the other is rabbit eye blueberry. The high bush is documented as being native to Tennessee. The rabbit eye, at least there's no historical records that I've been able to find. They may be around, but the strange thing about this is rabbit eye is more adapted to the Southeast than high bush. In fact, people say that rabbit eye is just the southern form of the high bush, but it's a different species. It will tolerate different types of soil, tolerate higher pHs, has a lot of blooms, early blooms, and it will produce a lot of fruit for you, I think. Mine, be starting my 4th year, and it is just filled with fruit now. Last year was good. I get a lot of birds coming in here, and I have 8 plants in my yard, as well as about 3 or 4 dwarfs that I have in containers that are all considered native rabbit eye blueberries. And why do I say this? Well, they're deciduous, but the rabbit eye is more common or you would find it in the Southeast US. Our zone hardiness from 6 to 9. Height, they can get fairly large. So you wouldn't want this in front of your window again, but it could be a foundation plant. Mine do very well. I'm using it again in an area similar to the Ninebark. It's the front screening area. So I'm using it kind of as a hedge. They will sprout. So they will spread on you, and that may be a good thing or it may be a bad thing. You just need to be aware of it. Spread up to, let's say, 8 feet, 15 feet high. That's a lot of blueberry. They bloom relatively early, March to April. Nice little white to pinkish flower. Full sun again, probably do okay in part shade, but full sun's best. Soil, medium. They have a very shallow root system, and if they're in a wet area, very wet area, probably won't do very well. Again, I said I'm using mine more or less as a hedge, but also to get the berries. Very showy flowers. Good fall color. They turn kind of a reddish. The leathery leaves Very pretty in the fall. They attract birds, they attract butterflies and other insects. And in fact, I walked up around my blueberry plants about a couple weeks ago, and the bumblebees and the carpenter bees were doing their job. They were pollinating these flowers like crazy. And the result of that is I'm going to have a lot of blueberries. The fruit is edible. One of the things you'd want to kind of make sure of is drainage. I'd keep it as good as you can. They will tolerate some moisture. So just to take a look at the comparison between high bush and rabbit eye, what we're looking at is if your soil doesn't have a low pH of, let's say, 4.5 to 5.5 that the high bush would really like. The rabbit eye should, and in fact it does in my yard, tolerate a little bit higher pH of, let's say, up to 6.5. Mine are doing very well. I have a kind of a cherty soil and they're tolerating that, but also one of the things that's different from the high bush, which is a more northern blueberry, is that they don't require that low chill factor requirement to bloom. So they bloom early. So you'll get flowers, like I said, from March until now, and therefore is pollen and nectar for a lot of the early pollinators that come out, as well as butterflies. So those are some reasons that steered me towards using rabbit eye for the most part, rather than high bush. But they sell a lot of high bush, and I'm sure it does very well here. But this seemed to give you a little more leeway in error. So I think a nice plant. Forming shrubs, one of the things that you will need is 2 or 3 of these at least. And if you can get different cultivars, that will help cross-pollination. So just be aware of those things. One blueberry plant probably give you some blueberries, but not many. The 2 or 3 or 4 of them, different cultivars of that will give you a prolonged season and a lot more blueberries. Another plant I like, just planted it last year actually, was American Beautyberry. Now, as you can see, this looks like it's in trouble, but this is fall. So the leaves, it's a deciduous plant, but you get this yellowish leaf color, but more spectacular, you get these berries that last into sometimes almost early winter, depending upon your bird population. Birds love these things. So you're going to get birds coming in to get your American Beautyberry, and is a good later food source for many of our seed or berry eating birds. So this is American Beautyberry, southeast US again, 3 to 6 feet. It spreads 3 to 6 feet. It's not a real organized type of plant. In other words, it kind of spreads out. So I would say you probably need a little bit of room for it. And 6 feet may actually be lower on the low side here. It can get bigger than that, but you would expect that as the 3 to 6 feet area. But realizing that it's not a real neat plant from the standpoint of being tidy, but one that kind of spreads out on you. Blooms are more or less insignificant. In fact, you could go and if you don't pay a whole lot of attention, you'll just miss them entirely until all of a sudden you get these lavender pink berries showing up, and you wonder where they came from. But the small flowers do require pollination, and we got small bees that do that. Again, sun, water, maintenance, I'd say put it in the medium category. just from the standpoint, if you want to maintain a more tidy plant, they bloom on new growth. So if you cut this back, let's say a foot to two, it will resprout from that and you'll get blooms that year. So it's not on old growth that they'll bloom, they'll grow on new. So that's one of the things that you may want to do to help keep it a little tidy and make sure you have blooming every year throughout the plant. Tracks birds, as we talked about, I think it's very showy with a winter interest. It will tolerate our clay soils around here. Okay, the ones I've talked about have been kind of primarily medium to dry. This is an area in my house. This is not a rock garden, and it's not a area that would normally be considered a rain garden. I did this wrong, but it's working. And I used river gravel stones here in a swell area I have that was a drainage problem. My yard goes up into a fairly steep slope, and drainage would just come through here and barely stay in my yard and just go out into the street that you can see in the upper right there. So I put this in and put in plants. These are almost entirely shrubs. I think there's about a half a dozen in here. And we'll talk about some of those that are tolerant of wetter areas. So if you have an area like that and you constructed a better rain garden than I did, then that will actually be helpful. Actually, I'll put in a note here quickly, is that I've been told river rock is not the way to go. People get upset. Some people get upset, is they're saying river rock's being overused, therefore they're going into our streams and creeks and dredging this. And the bad part of that is that there is a tremendous amount of growth of not only plants, but also insects that require this kind of cobble at the bottom of our streams. So probably not a good choice on my part, being an ecological gardener, but I did it without knowledge, and that's why I say read about these things. One of the plants that do very well here, I think, is Virginia Sweetspire. Look at the plant on the left. It just has these little droopy flowerlets. When it's blooming, butterflies, bees, other insects, small beetles, all come to these things to get nectar and pollen. One of the, this will almost turn a Merlot color in the fall, a dark purple almost, very beautiful leaves before they drop. The benefit of winter interest is that you get these little seed stalks from the flowers, and they're available for birds as well as just some winter interest. So to me, they have year-long winter interest. Deciduous shrub, 5 to 9. So you're talking an area that goes down into South Georgia, even Florida, up a little bit north of here. Can get fairly tall, so be aware of that. 3 to 10 feet, good spread on it. Bloom time here, we're kind of late spring, maybe early summer. You saw the white flowers, again, full sun to part shade, but here we're going from dry to medium, from medium to wet. So they tolerate wet feet, and therefore maybe a good rain garden plant. Maintenance is low, as I talked about rain gardens. Showy fragrant flowers, again, probably a reason for attracting all the pollinators. Good fall color. They tolerate they will tolerate heavy shade. And in fact, I have one growing in fairly heavy shade. It's growing very slowly, but is growing healthy. Again, erosion, have a good root system, clay soils and wet soils. Again, this is one that you can mass together with a number of different plants, or the same plant could kind of cause a little shrubby area underneath your woodland. Can be a foundation plant as well as a hedge. It naturalizes, which I think is important for me, in a wild, informal area. And if anything you can say about my gardening technique, it's wild and informal. Also good selection for wet locations that we talked about. So pond, stream edges, as well as rain garden areas. Now, this doesn't look like much, perhaps, but it's one of the focal areas now in this, let's call it a dry riverbed for lack of any other term. But you can see this is the red chokeberry. Blooms very early. In fact, mine has stopped blooming, is forming berries, and they form, create a bright red berry, and they're persistent. It's not the first choice of birds. They'll leave that red berry until late fall and into winter. And from your aspect, you got the leaves have fallen then, and you got these bright red berries over your plant. Finally, if birds have a hard time finding winter food, they'll come and get your red chokeberries. So it's a late food source for them. And as you can see, will tolerate red feet, wet feet, excuse me. And here you can see my backyard with that chain link fence. And if you look careful, you'll see the barbed wire on top. I have just started, when I took this picture, planting this area. It was a grassland in the back. And again, I can give some advice on what not to do with this, because I did it kind of backwards. But I finally got most of the grass out of it, but I'm planting trees and shrubs. So this is going to be a woodland area, because the house to my right, for whatever reason, they cut the woods, I'm sure, down that were here. And my neighbor to the right and further to the right, it's a mixed hardwood forest that they have in their backyard. So I'm trying to continue that in this area. Red chokeberry, again, kind of a medium-sized plant, growing in a fairly broad area from upper Midwest down to Florida. You can see the height. It may get 8 feet tall, but it's not so spreading. It's more of an erect shrub. Blooming time, I'd say even March to April, depending upon the temperatures that you have. These nice white blooms. Water, it will actually tolerate wet feet. This says medium, but it does do very well in not continually wet, but intermittently wet. Maintenance is very low. Hedges, naturalized areas, rain gardens at the edge, showy flowers. Again, good fall color from the aspect of particularly the berries have that winter interest. They got a good root system, so help in eroding areas and do well in clay soils. And I think I have actually 3 of these plants in different locations, and they actually have different growth forms somewhat because of that. But one of the things I've done here on this one is I kind of cut this up to do this, because I have what's called a swamp leather flower down here that does well with wet feet. It's a clematis, and it will go through this and twine through it. And it's not like a very small flower. We're not talking about perennials, but that's why I kind of trimmed this like this, so it will go up up that plant. So that's a function and something you may want to think about, of which I actually did. Multi-seasonal, stream sides again. Realize that it is a suckering plant, and that's one of the things you may want to take into here in that rocky area. So far, it's doing pretty well maintaining the suckering, not allowing it much. An area in the back I have, it seems to be doing some suckering. It's okay with me where it is. There's room. At some point, I may have to control it, but not now. Buttonbush, good plant for rain gardens. Interesting little flower. And just now starting to leaf out. You know, when you go out there and everything is starting to bloom or leaf, and this thing's sitting here looking like a dead plant, I go up there and I check the twigs to make sure that they aren't snapping off, but they're still very healthy and just now starting to leaf out a little bit. Common name, buttonbush, can get fairly large. So be aware of that. You may need a little more room, or you may need to go in and do a little maintenance occasionally. Here, these are blooming a little bit later into June. You saw the bloom, full sun. They do water use medium to wet. So these are going to be very good in a wet area if you meet the sun and shade requirements. Very low maintenance unless you don't want a plant that gets, it's at least from my experience, a relatively medium to slow grower. So mine is probably, it's been in there 4 years, planted at about maybe 2 feet. And right now it's maybe 4 feet high. So a foot a year, but it may change, but and it may be different for you. Hummingbirds are attracted to this flower, even though it's so small, but they'll come, but butterflies and other insects just love this thing. Showy, winter interest, primarily the seed heads, that little ball that you saw, each one of those things is just a little seed in here. So you just have a seed head in here. I have it outside window. Finches come and pick those seeds out of the seed head. A lot of them drop to the ground, and sparrows come around and pick up the seeds that fall. So a great bird feeding plant during the fall and into the winter. And those kind of brownish seed heads, again, I think are very attractive. That's kind of the end of what I have, but number of other plants that I do have in my yard that people may want to either ask questions about or talk about. I have the Bottlebrush Buckeye, red Buckeye. I have a couple different types of what's called serviceberry or amelanker. It's classified as a shrub. People may classify it as a small tree, but it's branchy, but it does get very big. And as opposed to the red chokeberry that the berries last into the winter, boy, as soon as these things turn, there's birds on these things and they're gone immediately almost. The serviceberry, my understanding, it's good for people to eat. We talked about red chokeberry. Well, there is a black chokeberry. I have that as well. I was talking to somebody, and it's maybe a little more dense. It suckers heavily and doesn't get quite as big. So maybe a foot or two shorter. But said, no, I don't use black chokeberry because as it indicates, the berries are black and they like the red ones. So it's a personal preference. Sweet shrub. This is one, it's supposed to grow anywhere. And I am trying, and I've on my second plant now that's hanging in, but it's supposed to be a very good plant for just about any place. I have not had a whole lot of success yet, but it has a beautiful maroon flower that is very fragrant. And here I'm putting it in a place that I want it to be, and evidently the plant doesn't want to be there. But I want that fragrance to go into our back porch, and I may have to put it someplace else. Silky dogwood is a plant that I put in, and it's in the rain garden, but it seems to do well in other places because I've taken cuttings and it seems to be growing well. Again, this is a more non-formal type of plant, multiple stems that kind of spread out, beautiful kind of clustering flowers as opposed to the dogwood flower, but nice berries. So it's a great plant, I think. Just now starting to use it more and more. American hazelnut, I did this, I put 2 in at the end of my property just to see if I can get hazelnuts. We'll see. And it's kind of a shrubby multi-stem plant that may get, they say maybe 8 feet. Strawberry bush, again, is a plant, hearts of bustin is what I always called it. Has that reddish little seed head or cluster, and then pops open with those red seeds, hearts of bustin. And my problem is that I'm not taking proper care of it. It wants to grow, but the rabbits and the deer seem to love it. So it gets chopped back to the ground. So I'm going to have to put something around it to get it up to maybe 2 or 3 feet. Well, it will survive better. Rhododendrons, so many different kinds. Consider them. The native azaleas I love, even though it's deciduous. But what a beautiful color. If you remember those orangey red flowers I had on the side of my house. Many different kinds of viburnum, great plant. Realize that a lot of them get fairly large, a lot of different cultivars. One of the things that you can look, if you love viburnum, but want something small, there may be a cultivar that will meet your need. So that's one of the reasons that to look at those. I have sumac growing naturally underneath that barbed wire fence in the back. I suspect birds have been perching there and planted my sumac for me, but there's different types, good cover, a great food source for the bird. Pawpaws are often classified as shrubs. They can get fairly large, depending upon, again, the native species, but multi-branched often. Spice bush, great plant. And drooping laurel is the only one that I know is native that is evergreen. I do have ilex, and they're mostly cultivars, which is holly. If you want to stay completely native with holly, look for the native species. Then do your research for others, because many have been crossed with Asian varieties. If that's a big deal for you and you don't want that, then look for the native species. Also, junipers of different kinds. You can get at all different kinds of heights for those. I got the native, but on the other hand, it may not be such a critical thing for you. So those are evergreens, as well as this drooping laurel, which is a heath plant. And it's one that grows up a little bit east of here natively in the woodlands, a little more acidic soils, but stays small and slow growing. I planted this in the wrong area to start with and almost killed it. And it was on the east facing part of my house, and it just got burned every summer. And I thought, I hung on to it and finally said, this isn't working, and moved it to the north side of my house, and it is starting to pick up. New leaves that come out are typically kind of reddish or pinkish color and then turn to green leathery. Stays maybe 3 to 4 feet at the most, but sprawls a little bit, so will take up some room, maybe 4 to 5 feet. but a long evergreen plant. Hopefully it does very well here, and I'll have a better story to tell you. There is another, this is in the Leucothiae family, of which there is one that is more common but gets a little bit bigger. This is maybe a little bit harder to find, but I found it through mail order and it seems to be doing well. If anybody would like to kind of chime in, I'm not sure if we have chat questions or people just want to ask questions. I'll slowly move through this list. This is Doug Ptolemy, who I mentioned, one of his first books, Bringing Nature Home. If you're interested in what I'm talking about, I think this is almost required reading. He's a PhD, Northeastern University, of which I don't remember, a lot of graduate students doing work in native plants, and certainly is a proponent of that, but breaks down all kinds of information and has numerous books that are easy to read and interesting. Native plants of the Southeast, I like Marjorie Hunter's book, Gardening with Native Plants in Tennessee. I kind of look for books that have the word Tennessee in it, that gives you a better idea of focus. This won't have shrubs in it, but if you're interested in perennials, Wildflowers of Tennessee, the Ohio Valley, and Southern Appalachians, good book. Lots of good information in there about perennials. Depending upon your interest on birds, which may be just renewed or starting to very experienced. If you're new, I would look for a bird. Here's one that says Birds of Tennessee, relatively small, doesn't cover every single bird in the East, so it gives you a better chance of identification. So if you're new to birding or looking at birds and identifying them, more than likely you have common birds rather than looking for exotics or less common birds. And it's very easy to make birds vary in color and plumage. So you can confuse these things. So identify the common ones first and get better. If you're interested in butterflies, here's Butterflies of Tennessee. Rita Venable lives up in the Knoxville area and put together a great book for Butterflies of Tennessee. I like Heather Holmes' Pollinators. If you're interested in pollinators in general, she has a couple of books out, focuses on her area is upper Midwest, but many of the plants, in fact, most of the plants she talks about and the species of pollinators occur here as well. So very helpful. If you're, again, new to this, we didn't talk about invasives here, but here's Tennessee Native Plant Alternatives to Exotic Invasives. If you're aware of invasive plants, there are Tennessee natives that are alternatives to this. And this just gives you a list of here's the exotic, here's some native plants you can substitute for it. So it's Google this and you'll find it. It's just more or less a listing of things. Landscapes with native plants. Again, if you want an idea of the native plants, this has a listing similar to what I laid out up front from the standpoint of perennials, shrubs, vines, ground covers, trees that are native. Tells you basic information of sun requirements, soil requirements, moisture requirements, and it's in a list form as well. So easy to kind of go through and start your work to see if any of these plants may fill a function of yours. The Xerces Society, if you're interested in invertebrates, they publish, I think most of it is peer reviewed. So good information about invertebrates, as well as many of the plants that are required to keep those invertebrates around. So with that, able to have plenty of time for questions, and I hope there are some.
I have a Ninebark that was planted about 2.5 years ago. We have a new home, so it was a blank slate. Anyway, it's called a Coppertina Ninebark. It's
Okay.
a variety. And it's planted in front of my house in a bed where it gets limited sun until, afternoon, sometimes late afternoon, mid to late in the summer.
Okay.
And I've had a trouble with fungus the last couple of years.
Oh, really?
Should I move it?
Offhand, I'd say unless you want to get into a spraying routine, they do well in full sun to partial shade, meaning 4 to 6 hours at a minimum. So if it's getting very low light, that could be the reason. I hate to tell you without, looking at this and or having somebody with expertise looking at it to say that, yeah, it's in the wrong place. But, if it's not doing well after 2 or 3 years, there's probably something that isn't right for it, even though it does tolerate a wide variety of habitats. But a beautiful plant. I'm kind of aware of that. And does yours, the bark kind of slough and have, to me, good front yard plant just from interest of that bark in the winter time?
Yeah, it does. It peels.
Yeah,
And
peels,
it has a beautiful flower. Last spring, it flowered beautifully. I don't know if it will flower this spring. And I have no objection to trying to move it because I move plants around that don't
Okay,
seem to be
good.
doing well in their current location. Would fall be the best time to do that?
Yeah, I would do that. It's getting, because root growth is starting to kind of go. I mean, it could be that you could get it out, particularly if it's only a few years old. But I would wait until fall or actually into the winter when root growth has stopped and get it in the ground so that new root growth can establish it.
Okay, I think that's what I'm going to do. Thanks so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you, Mary.
Okay, yes, I had 3 blueberry bushes. 2 of them died, and the one I had left had lots of blueberries last year. So I'd like to get some more. But if I plant that the one you talked, rabbit eye, but there is different cultivars I need to get. Is that correct?
That's best. I mean, it more or less ensures that you're going to have good. If it's coming from a different plant, you'll get more blooms as well as therefore more fruit. But no matter what, you'll get some fruit. Sounds like with one plant you're doing well, but I would kind of look for different ones, or if you can't find or don't know what cultivar you have, just getting 1 or 2 more would be helpful.
They say I thought you had to have 2 or 3 blueberries for them to even produce, but this thing was best it's ever done last year. I had enough to make 2 huge cobblers with it.
Oh,
and
wow.
then eat some. So I for one little bush, and it had never done that well before.
How big is it?
It's probably about 2 feet tall.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Yeah,
well, that's
I've had
great.
it several years, but it's never done anything till last year. So it may take that long to do it. But the other 2 died, but this one is doing great. But I wanted to get enough to be able to put up some, make some blueberry jelly.
Oh yeah, that'd be great. Like the plants I have, as soon as they start to fruit out, that's when the grandkids want to come out and visit. Okay, thank you very much, Sherry.
Do you prune beauty berries?
I did this year just because at least mine, I planted it last year, and that thing, I wasn't expecting it. I mean, it grew. It was probably 4 feet high and 5 feet wide and sprawling out. And the base of it went to almost from nothing. I mean, it was probably 6 or 8 inches high when I planted it to a 4-foot shrub with branches that were almost an inch across. So I cut it back in the winter and to about 1.5 feet. I wasn't going to, and then I said, well, I'll cut this one and this one. And then I said, well, I'll just cut them all. And I went out the other day, and it's starting to, sprout out now. So I think it'll do well. Again, most of my soil is clay to clay chert area, and it's doing very well in there. Yeah, when I've gone through, in fact, I was volunteer when I lived in Atlanta in the Atlanta Botanical Garden, and their native area, they had sweet shrub, and it was an understory plant. So it was doing pretty well in shade to partial shade very well. If you want it in a different place, it's supposed to tolerate those things. I'd be kind of careful. I'd move it again, winter time if you're going to move it, because if you start moving something from shade to a very sunny area, I mean, you get leaf scalding, all kinds of things could happen that may make you a little sad, but it again supposed to do well. I have mine in a sunny area that has medium moisture, and my hope is I have some plants, the old thing, the first year they don't do anything, second year they start to grow, and third year they go crazy. So I'm hoping, I've gone through 2 years with the one I have, so my hope is this year it will take off, and if it doesn't, I'm going to have to find a different place for my sweet shrub.
Ron,
Yes.
it really needs to grow in the shade. I
Yeah.
have it in the north side of my house in a wooded area, and it's multiplying like rabbits.
Right. Yeah, I kind of figured that. Again, I'm pushing having it where closer to the house where I can get the scent, but I'm losing that battle. I can't will it to live, so I'm going to have to move mine, I'm sure. Pat, thank you. And I knew that, but
Does sweet shrub want moist soil or rocky soil?
What's yours like, Pat? I would say, medium soils, I'd say a humusy soil from where I've seen it naturally, it's done very well. I don't know what it will, it's supposed to tolerate other soil types, but.
I'm on Signal Mountain, and
Oh,
we mulched the area so I have a top layer of soil, but basically we have chert.
yeah. So it's doing very well in that. That's good.
Yeah.
That's good to know.
I live on a ridge line in Collegedale, and I was interested in planting mountain laurels, but I can't find anyone that at the nurseries that will carry them. Do I have to do mail order, and also what kind of conditions am I looking at? Every state park we go to, if you're doing any hiking, you can see an abundance of them, but.
Right. Yeah. It sounds like you may be living in a good place for them. I have read about mountain laurel, and it didn't kind of fit in. It didn't sound like it was going to be an easy plant for me. And my hope is to have plants that do well where I am. But
Right.
You see those like you're saying, ridge sides, that type of thing. And have you seen others growing in the area that you're at, or?
No.
Yeah. So, I mean, I always say it's worth a try, particularly if you get a smaller plant you don't have to spend an arm and a leg for.
Okay.
And yeah, I haven't seen them in the nurseries around here either, now that you've mentioned it. I don't remember them being in reflection writing, but if you're familiar, reflection writing has a plant sale,
Okay.
well, every Saturday, and you can go online and they'll have the plants that they have.
Okay.
So you can just read and see if they happen to have mountain laurel. Most of their plants are typically small and reasonable.
First, I just want to thank you, Ron, for giving a great seminar today. Thank you, Suzanne. I want to thank you for wrangling the questions today. I want to thank Carol Matthews for scheduling Ron. And I want to thank Ron at the last year for giving another great presentation. We've called on Ron for several times, and he's responded every time. And just thank you again for giving
I
a great
appreciate
talk this third Saturday.
Thank you.
Take care now, everybody.
You bet.
So long.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you next month.